Hey, it's Alex from Motoroso.com, your dedicated auto parts marketplace. Today we're in the studio and we've got our friend Mandy's 2018 Toyota Tacoma 4x4 back in the studio. Last week we installed the Nerf sidebars. This week we're going to be making room for her wheels and tires by installing a MaxTrac leveling kit. Check out Motoroso.com/shop for all your parts needs. Let's go ahead and get started. Before we get started with our install, let's take a close-up look at the MaxTrac leveling kit. So it's model 836825-4. It's about $120 and it's available for purchase on Motoroso.com/shop. It's a fairly simple kit. It comes with your strut spacers, 1-inch spacers for the differential on the front, as well as 1/2-inch spacers for your skid plate and all the necessary hardware. This kit we're installing on a 2018 Tacoma, but this is the same kit for a 2005 to 2019 Tacoma FJ Cruiser and 4Runner. All right, the tools you're gonna need for this job are simple, but pretty numerous. Get yourself a big breaker bar and a big torque wrench. We recommend a 14mm ratcheting end box wrench for the top of those shock struts. You're gonna need a crescent wrench. I pulled out all my ratchets and we're gonna use every socket from 12 to 22, and we're actually doubling down on 14s, 19s, and 22s. You're gonna need Loctite in a few spots, probably an adapter or two, the Sharpies for marking the lower control arm, and you're gonna need a rubber mallet in case anything needs any encouragement. All right, our first step is gonna be to get the wheel off and get the truck up on the jack. So we're gonna use our braking bar to just loosen up the lug nuts on the wheel before we get the truck up on the jack. All right, so we're gonna put the jack under the crossmember brace here just to get a little bit of air under the tire. All right, let's just get the lug nuts the rest of the way off here. All right, with the wheel off, we can now get a good look at our suspension on this Tacoma. So we're going to be pulling the entire shock strut out and putting the spacer onto the top of the shock strut and then reinstalling that. So that means we're taking the nuts out off the top, the bolt out off the bottom, and sliding it all out. But in order to do that, we're gonna be needing to remove our sway bar link nut and get that out of the way. We're gonna need to loosen and remove our steering knuckle nut as well. And then back here on the lower control arm, the alignment nuts are gonna need to be loosened, not removed. But in order to do all of this, we're actually gonna also have to get the skid plate out of the way, which is gonna have to be out of the way for the differential shims as well. So we're gonna remove that skid plate first. All right, so this is our skid plate here, and there's 4 bolts to be removed. We got 2 at the back here, and you're gonna use a 12mm to get those off, and a 12mm to get the 2 up here at the front. And once you've pulled those bolts out, the skid plate tips to the front and hooks off the rear. All right, with our skid plate off, now we're gonna start by using our 17mm socket to remove the sway bar link, and we're gonna need to use the jack to provide a little bit of relief to pull that all the way out. And I'm gonna use a breaker bar to get in there and break that loose initially, nice and easy. And then I'm gonna switch to my socket, wrench, my ratchet to get it the rest of the way off. All right, with our sway link nut removed, now we put the jack under the lower control arm, and we put a little towel there to protect it. We're just gonna jack this up until you see the sway bar link loosen, and then you can slide that straight out. And with your sway link out, go ahead and lower that jack back down slowly to relieve the pressure on that lower control arm. All right, so we're gonna make a mark on our camber plate and as a reference point to try and match that when we put this all back together and tighten it. Now, this is not a replacement for having an alignment, but this is to try and get it as close as you can. So making these marks is gonna help you line everything back up when you tighten it back up. We're not gonna be removing this nut, we're just gonna be loosening it so that we can manipulate the lower control arm. But again, you probably want to get in alignment. That's really the best way to do this. Now there's obviously this side and then also the other side on the lower control arm. So mark both sides and then we're gonna loosen it all. Okay, so now we're gonna loosen our lower control arm bolt here, and this is a 21 millimeter, and I couldn't find my 21 millimeter open-ended wrench, so I'm just using a crescent wrench to hold that side fixed, but just gonna use the breaker bar to crack this open. We are not removing this altogether, we are just loosening it. All right, on this side, doing the same exact thing, holding it steady with my crescent wrench and using the breaker bar to break that free. And it seems to need quite a few turns, so after going halfway with the breaker bar, it's a little easier to switch to the ratchet to get a few extra turns a little bit more easily, but the breaker bar is pretty necessary to get that initial loosening. Okay, next we're gonna use our 14 millimeter ratcheting box end wrench to loosen up the 3 nuts at the very top. Now I've already loosened this one. My wrench is not quite long enough to do that just with my hand, so I'm actually using my mallet to get my initial nudge on that. Okay, now we're ready to loosen the bolt and nut at the bottom of the shock strut. So I'm using a 19 millimeter socket to hold the bolt side steady, and I'm gonna use my braking bar and a 19 millimeter long socket to break loose the nut on the front side. A little bit awkward, but we'll get it off. And this is the steering knuckle nut, and that is a 24 millimeter. And so I'm going to use my braking bar to break that free. All right, and next we're gonna take that bolt and just kind of bang it through from the bottom of the shock strut. And you have to wiggle this out, you have to work a little bit to get it out. But once that pops out, your lower control arm can drop down, and now our shock is just about ready. We just gotta take the rest of the nuts off the top and we can slide the shock out. All right, so we're gonna pull our nuts off that we already loosened up in one of our previous steps. I'm just supporting the shock from the bottom so it doesn't just fall out. It is not going to be that easy, but just in case. And once these nuts are off, we should be able to ease this shock down past the control arm. Okay, we've got our strut off, and I've applied a little bit of grease to the back side of our strut spacer. That's just gonna get placed right over the stock posts there, and then use your new 14 millimeter nuts to thread those straight on to attach the spacer to the strut. But I'm gonna just put a touch of thread locker there just to make sure that this holds. And then we're gonna tighten these down to 60 foot-pounds of torque just to make sure it stays put. All right, now I've pre-applied some thread locker. After we, of course, put our spacer back on the strut, we're ready to just go ahead and put this back up and get it in place and let it hang there from the stock nuts. super easy. All right, so we got the strut back up into the strut tower, and I used my torque wrench here to tighten that down to 60 foot-pounds of torque with the stock nuts on the top of the new bolts from the plate. So we'll get a close-up shot of the plate in there later. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna connect the lower control arm back to the base of the shock, and then push it back up and connect the lower control arm to the steering spindle. Okay, now we've got our bolt back in for the lower shock strut. We're ready to use this jack to move the lower control arm up so that we can move our, we can replace our bolt through to the steering knuckle. Okay, now we've got the lower control arm connected back to the spindle. We're ready to connect the sway bar link up. We're not gonna tighten it down just yet, but we do wanna get it in place. Now, we've jacked up the other side of the truck so that it's even, because if it's not, the sway bar will get all wonky in there and do its job and cause everything to not line up. But we're using the jack to just press the control arm up. So we're just gonna move that jack slowly. Give that a nice gentle tap, and then we're just going to thread our nut on this side, and we're not going to tighten this down until the very end. Okay, now we've got everything roughly back together now. Everything's kind of in the place that it needs to be. We have fully torqued down our top nuts to the top of the shock to 60 foot-pounds torque. We've placed our bolts back to the bottom of the steering knuckle, and those are torqued down to 100 foot-pounds torque. And our bolt is in and the nut is on the lower of the shock mount, but not fully tightened down yet. We're gonna do that in a minute, and we're gonna go for 100 foot-pounds torque there. You're gonna wanna also tighten down your sway bar link and go 60 foot-pounds torque on that. Now, your camber alignment adjustments on the lower control arm there, that is not to be tightened down until the truck is back down on its wheel. So it gets a little bit awkward. So you gotta really get under there. And there's a nut inside the actual tightening nut, or a place to put a wrench. And then that adjusts the cam. And then what you wanna do is sort of turn that cam plate until you're lined up with the marks that we made before we loosened everything up. And this is gonna get you as close back to the factory settings as we can. This does not mean you don't need an alignment though. So, go drive the truck after you've done that. If you don't notice anything, sure, maybe you can take the risk, but the way to do it right is to go in, get everything tested, get it professionally aligned after. It's not that expensive, and it'll prevent any premature wear and tear. But all right, so we're gonna go ahead and tighten our lower shock bolt, our sway bar link, and then we'll be able to put the wheel back on, do the other side, put everything down, and do our alignment. And then, of course, we're also gonna still need to install our spacers under the front differential. And yes, I did almost just forget to mention that, but we're gonna get into that next. All right, so we're gonna tighten the lower shock bolt down and go for 100 foot-pounds torque. It's a little bit awkward to get in there, but just hold one side and then tighten the nut down. And now we'll tighten our sway bar link, 60 foot-pounds torque here. All right, everything except our lower control arm is fully tightened up and snugged down to torque specifications. Now we need to install our 1-inch spacer on the left and the right side next to the front differential. So we'll get under the truck and we'll show you where this is at. But basically what we're gonna be doing is using a 22mm socket to remove the bolt that is currently there, then jack the truck up, make a little bit of space between that mount and the truck. Then your 1-inch shim will go in between, and then your new bolt will go up through, and then you'll tighten that down with a washer and your nylon lock nut on the top. Now the top of this is not 22, this is 21. So it's a 22mm OEM bolt to take out, and then you'll need a 21 socket to put the new bolt in. Okay, so from this angle, you can see the bolts that we need to take out here near the front differential. There's one here and there's one on the other side. Now there's a top nut, which I'm gonna hold with my crescent wrench. So I'm gonna place this up here just as a placeholder. And then I'm gonna get sort of in here and use my breaker bar to break free this 22 millimeter bolt. And once that's all broken up, then I'm gonna go do the other side. Then what we do is we jack, push up the jack and then place in our 1-inch shim. And then we use our new bolts and our new washer and nut to complete the installation. Okay, so now as you can see, we've got the differential brace mount thing here lowered down. And this is the new bolt that goes through, and this is the OEM little sort of sunken in washer thing. And then our new spacer is up in the middle. And what we want to do is basically get this up through so that we can place our washer and nylon lock nut. And I'm having to use a rubber mallet to just kind of coax this up a little bit. Okay, once we get that tightened down with the simple ratchet, we'll use the torque wrench to tighten it down to 100 foot-pounds of torque. All right, now with this tightened down with the regular ratchet, we're gonna use our torque wrench to get it down to 100 foot-pounds of torque. All right, so we just took a bit of a break and we didn't video the other side, but we completed the other side. You didn't need to see that again. And just to go back through everything that we've done, we've removed the shock strut, mounted our plate back on, and we put everything back together. We tightened our top 14 millimeter nuts down to 60 foot-pounds of torque, our sway bar length down to 60 foot-pounds of torque, our steering knuckle bolts down to 100 foot-pounds of torque, and our lower shock bolt down to 100 foot-pounds of torque, as well as we've installed our 1-inch shims at the front of the front differential, and we've tightened the new bolt and nylon lock nut down to 100 foot-pounds of torque. With everything in and fully tightened down, but we have left the lower control arm not tightened. And so what needs to happen next is we're gonna put the wheels back on both sides. We're gonna put the truck back down. This is gonna be a little harder to shoot. We're gonna try and get the video, but what we're gonna then do is go in, get our alignment back to as close as we can get it because we made our marks, as close as we can get it back to what it was before we started the project. And then tighten everything down, and that's gonna be really, really tight, like 100 to 150 foot-pounds of torque. Go as hard as you can on that. And then put your skid plate back on last because you can't do the front alignment plate with the skid plate on. And when you put your skid plate back on, you're gonna use your stock bolts at the front, and then at the back, you're gonna use your new 1/2-inch spacer that you get with your MaxTrac kit and your longer M8 bolts. All right, so we marked our alignment plates before we loosened everything up, and now what we need to do is get them as close as we can back to where they were. And again, this is not a replacement for getting an alignment. You should get an alignment. But you can see, actually, they didn't move too much from where we are. I made 3 marks. I'm just gonna give this alignment plate just a little bit of a nudge in the right direction, and then it should be spot on with where it was. And now that, and we can just tighten down. All right, that wraps up our installation of the MaxTrac leveling kit, model number 836825-4. Take you about 2 hours, costs about $120, available at Motoroso.com/shop. We'll put a link to that and all of our other leveling kits in the description. When you're ready to shop for parts, check out Motoroso.com/shop, where you can browse hundreds of thousands of the top name brand products in the automotive aftermarket, sold by trusted vendors at great prices, and our shipping is always free. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel for all of our future videos. Thanks for watching.